Hello and welcome to Tales from the Dark Realm. I'm your host, Michael J. Elliott. Let the tales begin. You know, the Chinese have a saying, revenge is a dish that's best served cold. And I tend to agree with that. And you might feel the same way too after you've watched this creepypasta story entitled Lunch at Number 8.
Elizabeth Burdock and Margaret Creswick had lived at Bishop's Way for nigh on 35 years. Elizabeth lived at number 8 and Margaret lived at number 10. Both Elizabeth and Margaret had moved into Bishop's Way as blushing brides during the Second World War. As often happens with new neighbours, a quick "good morning" metamorphed into a quick chat over the fence. Elizabeth and Margaret invited each other over for the traditional British icebreaker, the cup of tea. Over numerous cups of tea, the two ladies had discussed their lives, their likes and dislikes, and of course their husbands. If you asked either woman who was the first to invite the other over for lunch, neither lady would be able to tell you. It was in fact Margaret who asked Elizabeth over for tea and sandwiches. Thus, a Wednesday afternoon tradition was born. When both women became mothers, the friendship was cemented. Their children played together as toddlers and they attended the same school. Elizabeth had 3 children, Thomas, Vera and Mary. Margaret had 2, Joan and Lionel. Children are a wonderful adhesive to help strengthen a friendship. Elizabeth and Margaret attended all the school concerts, sports days, and various extracurricular activities. The two women shared many of life's ups and downs: weddings, engagements, the birth of grandchildren, and the sadness that comes from a bereavement. Now, I don't want to imply that the only social events that took place in Bishop's Way involved merely Elizabeth and Margaret. Many of the street residents had children who attended the same school. Naturally, Margaret and Elizabeth knew the other parents. They spoke to one another at school functions and sporting events. Many of their husbands, including Elizabeth's husband Owen and Margaret's husband Ted, drank down at the local pub. Because Elizabeth and Margaret had lived in Bishop's Way longer than anyone else, it conferred a sort of matriarchal power upon them. Whenever something like a street party needed organising, the residents deferred to Elizabeth and Margaret's seniority. When the council decided to close their branch of the library, the residents asked Margaret and Elizabeth to take up the protest. Of the two women, Elizabeth was the most vociferous. She was always quick to voice her disapproval over one thing or another. When the Weatherbys at number 27 painted their front door a hideous pink colour, Elizabeth visited them and demanded that they change it to something more in keeping with the street's character. Margaret's attitude was more one of, well, live and let live. The trouble began when Eloise Perkins died. Eloise had lived at number 12. She'd lived next door to Elizabeth. Eloise had lived at number 12 with her husband Sid for 22 years. When Sid died from a heart attack, Eloise rapidly went downhill. She stopped eating, she barely left the house, and she hardly spoke to a soul. Margaret said she was suffering from a broken heart. Nobody on Bishop's Way was really surprised when Eloise passed away quietly in her sleep a few months after Sid. Their only child, Marion, decided against selling her parents' house. She decided that renting it out would provide a nice little nest egg to fund her retirement. The relative peace and quiet of Bishop's Way was shattered when the Petersons moved into number 12. They were in a de facto relationship, something Margaret and Elizabeth didn't approve of. Judy and David had 2 boys. As far as Elizabeth and Margaret were concerned, the children already had a black mark against their name for having been born out of wedlock. The boys were 12 and 8. Margaret called them nasty little pieces of work. They would hurl obscenities at passers-by. They smoked and dropped their rubbish in the street. Everyone in the street talked about it, but only Elizabeth had the courage to do anything about it. She knocked on the Petersons' front door and demanded their mother keep a tighter rein on them. Judy Peterson simply laughed. Then she blew cigarette smoke in Elizabeth's face and slammed the front door on her. The other member of the Peterson household was their West Highland Terrier, Toby. He was a friendly dog, but he was not controlled by the Petersons. He'd freely wandered down Bishop's Way, entering residents' gardens. He'd dig holes in their lawns, mess on the grass, and scrounge through rubbish bins looking for food scraps. During their regular Wednesday lunch, Margaret and Elizabeth began to talk about the dog's antics. "He's a destructive little monster," said Elizabeth. "I suspect it's because he's never really been trained or disciplined." Elizabeth snorted derisively. "I'm sure they never bothered." "Oh, it's a shame. He's such a friendly little fellow." "That's no excuse for its behaviour." Margaret knew that it wasn't just the dog's destructive behaviour that upset Elizabeth. It had become a lot more personal. "My flower bed is utterly destroyed." Elizabeth had always been very proud of her front garden. Small though the front yards of the houses may have been, most residents of Bishop's Way took pride in them, no one more so than Elizabeth. Elizabeth's front yard was not of pinks and yellows and purples. It was a riot of all colours. That was until 2 days ago. Elizabeth had come home from town to discover her beloved petunias had been dug up. The jonquils were chewed and trampled, and flower petals and stems were strewn all over the grass. Leading out from the garden onto the footpath were a set of paw prints. The culprit was obvious. Elizabeth didn't even bother confronting the Petersons about the destruction. She went straight to the police. They listened sympathetically and promised to have a word with the Petersons. That never happened. "I've got a good mind to sue them," fumed Elizabeth. Margaret sipped her tea. "Oh, they don't look like they have a halfpenny between them." Elizabeth was not to be put off. "I'm sure there's something of value. People like the Petersons usually do have something." Margaret knew how determined Elizabeth could be and decided not to pursue the matter. A week later, Margaret was surprised to see the Peterson boys standing on her doorstep. Rather than the belligerent and cocky boys she was so accustomed to, they appeared solemn and contrite. "Excuse me, have you seen Toby?" Margaret looked surprised. "No, I haven't. I didn't even know he was missing." The younger boy nodded. We've made these to put up. Will you put some to hand out, please, missus?" He handed Margaret a few sheets of A4 paper. There was a picture of Toby with the word "missing" in large letters across the top. Below Toby's pictures were the Petersons' contact details. Margaret couldn't help but feel sorry for the boys. Perhaps their love for Toby was their key to seeing the true nature of the boys. "I'll hand those out, and I'll keep an eye out for Toby." By the following week, Toby still hadn't been spotted. "Well, I wasn't certainly going not to help them find the wretched beast," said Elizabeth, setting the table for lunch. "I can understand how you feel, Elizabeth, especially since what he did to your garden. But if you'd just seen those boys' faces—" "The dog wouldn't be lost if they'd kept their gate secured." Margaret felt it better not to pursue the matter any further, lest Elizabeth begin a tirade about responsibility and how to be a good neighbour. "I'm sorry, Margaret. It's only sandwiches today." "Really? I thought I could smell something cooking," said Margaret, sounding a little disappointed. "It's a casserole. For the Peterson boys." Margaret was taken aback. "Elizabeth, you old fraud. Despite everything you've said, you've still made that family a meal." And Elizabeth sniffed haughtily as she poured them a cup of tea. "I may not approve of them, but I'm still a Christian, Margaret." "Turn the other cheek and all that," said Margaret a tad sarcastically. Something along those lines. "Well, bless you, Elizabeth. May be the beginning of a change for the better." "I hope you're referring to the Petersons, dear." Oh, of course," added Margaret quickly. Over their lunch of sandwiches and cakes, they spoke of many things, but mainly family matters. Margaret suddenly realised she'd forgotten to take her blood pressure pills. "Oh, Elizabeth, I'll just get myself a glass of water if you don't mind." Elizabeth gave the teapot a shake. "Would you like me to make another pot, dear?" Margaret glanced at her watch. No, thank you, Elizabeth. I'd love to stay and natter, but I'm babysitting the grandchildren this afternoon, and I shall be frightfully late." After such a lengthy friendship, it wasn't unusual for the women to enter each other's kitchens and help themselves to glasses, cups, and the like. After filling her glass with water, Margaret was taken with the aroma of the casserole. The kitchen was filled with the pleasant smells of spices and slow-cooking vegetables. The blue enamel pot stood invitingly on the stove. Margaret decided to sample the casserole. She removed the lid and breathed in the meaty aroma. Margaret grabbed the ladle, sitting on the spoon rest. She gave the casserole a stir. Large chunks of carrot and parsnip and swede came to the surface. She smiled to herself. Elizabeth could be as hard as nails, but how she was being kind. This was one of her most charitable acts, and she really was a quite charitable soul. Margaret decided to try a small sample. As she lifted the ladle to her lips, Margaret dropped her glass of water. It shattered, spraying her legs with water. Margaret let out an ear-piercing scream. Sitting in the ladle, amongst the chunks of meat and vegetables, was a gravy-stained dog collar.
Well, there you go. I hope you've enjoyed our first entry into the realms of the dark. Please join us again for some more creepypasta stories. We upload these each week for you, okay? And you'll find a plethora of different stories to amuse, bewilder and frighten you. So if you have liked what you've seen today, please hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to us, and we'll see you again very, very soon. Birthday